For 16 years, nobody questioned why the ferry captain knew every current in the harbor, why he could navigate in zero visibility, why he always kept emergency gear within arm's reach. The hijackers were about to find out why. Welcome to True Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden heroism and maritime courage, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the silent guardians of our waters. The Harbor Queen cut through the morning waters of San Francisco Bay like she had every day for the past 16 years. The city ferry was a lifeline connecting the downtown terminal to Angel Island, carrying commuters, tourists, and locals across the choppy waters. At 185 feet long and capable of carrying 400 passengers, she was both a workhorse and a symbol of the bay's maritime heritage. Captain Robert "Bob" Sullivan had been at her helm since 2007, when he'd taken the job after what he called a career change. At 53, he was the kind of mariner who understood that the sea demanded respect, preparation, and constant vigilance. His passengers knew him as a quiet professional who kept precise schedules and had never missed a day of work in 16 years. Most of the regular commuters appreciated Bob's steady competence. He knew their names, remembered their routines, and had an uncanny ability to predict weather changes hours before they showed up on official forecasts. During the morning rush, he'd navigate through fog so thick that other captains would cancel their runs. But Bob would bring the Harbor Queen home every time. The elderly passengers especially trusted him. Mrs. Garcia, who visited her grandchildren on Angel Island every Tuesday, always said Bob made her feel safe even in rough weather. "Captain Bob's got radar in his head," joked Lisa Chen, a marketing executive who'd taken the ferry to work every day for 8 years. "I swear he could navigate this bay blindfolded." "Probably could," agreed Tom Rodriguez, a teacher who commuted to the island school district. "My kids love him, always waves at them and remembers their names, makes the whole trip feel safer somehow." But there were things about Captain Sullivan that didn't quite add up, if you knew what to look for. He kept emergency equipment positioned throughout the ferry in patterns that seemed excessive for civilian maritime operations. Life preservers weren't just stored in regulation locations, they were strategically placed for rapid deployment in multiple scenarios. His bridge was organized with military precision, every instrument positioned for instant access during crisis situations. The most telling detail was his habit of checking passenger manifests before every departure, studying faces with the intensity of someone trained to spot threats in crowds. The Harbor Patrol had noticed his unusual competence over the years. Bob could read weather patterns like a meteorologist, predict equipment failures before they happened, and handle maritime emergencies with calm professionalism. During the 3 serious incidents the ferry service had experienced, Bob had responded with textbook crisis management that saved lives and prevented disasters. Most telling of all, Bob had an unusual relationship with maritime security protocols. He knew Coast Guard frequencies, understood Harbor Patrol procedures, and could identify potential security threats with unusual accuracy. "Guy thinks like law enforcement," muttered Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos of the Harbor Patrol, a 20-year Coast Guard veteran who'd worked with Bob during several incidents. "Sometimes I think he'd make a better security officer than half my team. Never panics, always knows exactly what to do." What Maria didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Captain Sullivan had spent 20 years in the Navy, including 12 years as a SEAL, specializing in maritime operations and coastal infiltration. He'd been part of teams that conducted shipboarding operations, harbor security assessments, and underwater demolition missions in dangerous waters. His most haunting mission had been in the Persian Gulf, where terrorists had hijacked a passenger ferry similar to his own. Bob's team had retaken the vessel, but not before seeing what desperation could drive people to do to innocent civilians. His final deployment had been to the Persian Gulf, where he'd spent 14 months conducting covert operations against maritime terrorist networks. That mission had ended with a classified operation involving a hijacked civilian ferry that Bob never discussed. Bob had left the Navy in 2007 with an honorable discharge and skills that translated perfectly to civilian maritime operations. The ferry job had been ideal. It allowed him to stay on the water while using his expertise in a peaceful environment. For 16 years, he'd found peace in the rhythm of harbor crossings, treating each trip like a mission that required constant preparation and flawless execution. His vessel was his responsibility, his passengers were his cargo, and the bay was his area of operations that he protected with the same professional dedication he'd once brought to military missions. But on a Tuesday morning in April, Bob's two worlds collided in the most violent way possible. It was 9:47 a.m. when they boarded. Bob was conducting his pre-departure safety check when he noticed them among the morning passengers. 9 men who moved with coordinated discipline through the boarding process. They were dressed like tourists, but Bob could see details that set off every alarm his military training had installed. Professional surveillance habits, tactical positioning, communications equipment disguised as civilian electronics. Most importantly, they carried bags with a weight distribution that suggested serious hardware concealed inside. Bob recognized the formation immediately. It was textbook terrorist cell deployment, designed to control a vessel while minimizing the chance of passenger resistance. Bob's blood went cold as he watched them take positions throughout the ferry. 3 near the main passenger deck, 2 positioned near the emergency exits, 2 more near the engine room access, and 2 who stayed close to the boarding area where they could control passenger movement. This wasn't a random group of travelers. This was a coordinated assault team preparing to take his vessel, and Bob had seen this exact formation before in classified briefings. Bob slipped into the bridge and activated the encrypted communication system he'd installed years earlier. But before he could key the microphone, one of the men appeared in the doorway, no longer bothering to conceal the automatic pistol in his hand. "Step away from the radio, Captain," the man said in accented English. "We'll be taking over navigation from here." Bob raised his hand slowly, his mind already shifting into a mode he thought he'd left behind 16 years ago. Threat assessment, tactical options, asset protection. The quiet ferry captain was disappearing, replaced by the Navy SEAL who'd once retaken hijacked vessels in waters far more dangerous than San Francisco Bay. 9 targets, unknown additional weapons, approximately 200 passengers including a school group from Oakland and several elderly tourists. Complex maritime environment with limited escape routes and challenging tactical variables. It was exactly the kind of shipboarding scenario he'd trained for his entire military career. "What do you want?" Bob asked, keeping his voice steady while his eyes cataloged every detail of the man's equipment and positioning. "Safe passage to international waters," the hijacker replied. "Your cooperation, and no one gets hurt." But Bob could see the lie in the man's eyes. These weren't criminals looking for ransom or political refugees seeking escape. The tactical coordination, the professional equipment, the careful timing. This was a terrorist operation, and Bob knew from bitter experience how these situations ended. "You're in charge," Bob said, stepping away from the controls with his hands visible. "Just don't hurt my passengers." The hijacker smiled coldly and spoke into his radio in a language Bob recognized as Arabic. Within minutes, the other 8 men had revealed their weapons and taken control of the passenger areas. Bob could hear children crying and adults trying to comfort them as the reality of their situation became clear. Bob was ordered to maintain course toward international waters where a larger vessel was supposedly waiting to transfer the passengers. But Bob knew the truth. No one was coming to rescue these people. The hijackers had turned his ferry into a floating prison, and once they reached their destination, the harbor queen and everyone aboard would disappear forever. Time to act. Bob began with subtle sabotage. While maintaining the appearance of cooperation, he gradually reduced the ferry's speed by making minor adjustments to the engine controls. He activated the automated distress beacon disguised as routine maintenance and sent coded position updates through the emergency locator system that would alert harbor patrol to his situation. But the hijackers were getting suspicious of the delays. The leader ordered Bob to increase speed, threatening to execute passengers if the ferry didn't reach the rendezvous point on schedule. That's when Bob made his move. Using the ferry's intercom system, he announced what sounded like a routine navigation update. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor mechanical difficulties that require passengers to move away from the rear deck for safety reasons." To the hijackers, it sounded like standard maritime procedure. To Bob, it was a tactical maneuver designed to clear civilians from his primary area of operations. He'd learned in the Gulf that saving hostages meant controlling their positions first. The first hijacker never saw it coming. Bob emerged from the bridge using a route through the engine compartment that only he knew existed, moving with silent efficiency. The man guarding the engine room access was focused on the passenger deck, unaware that his target was approaching from behind through a maintenance hatch. A life preserver became a weapon, and suddenly, the hijacker was unconscious and zip-tied with emergency equipment Bob had positioned for exactly this scenario. 1 down, 8 to go. But the remaining hijackers were starting to notice that their communications had gone quiet. Bob heard urgent Arabic over the radio he'd taken from the first target, voices demanding status reports that would never come. The leader was getting suspicious. He ordered his remaining men to tighten their control over the passengers while he personally went to check on the engine room guard. Bob was ready for him. Using the ferry's own layout against his enemies, Bob had turned familiar maritime equipment into tactical advantages. The second and third hijackers went down when Bob used the ferry's fire suppression system to flood their position with foam. The fourth and fifth were neutralized when Bob activated the emergency ballast system, creating enough chaos for rapid engagement. The remaining 4 hijackers had gathered their hostages on the main deck, where they could maintain visual contact with each other and better control the situation. Among the terrified passengers, Bob could see faces he'd transported thousands of times. Regular commuters who trusted him to get them safely across the bay, families with children who'd chosen his ferry for a day trip to Angel Island, elderly tourists who'd saved for months to visit San Francisco. These weren't just passengers to Bob, they were his people, his responsibility, his mission. The final assault came from the water itself. Bob used the Harbor Queen's own systems against the hijackers, cutting power to create darkness, then activating the emergency lighting to strobe in patterns that disoriented attackers while giving him tactical advantage. Using smoke from the engine room and the ferry's motion in the bay's natural swells, he moved through the passenger deck like a ghost. The remaining hijackers found themselves fighting an enemy who knew every inch of the battlefield and had turned their escape route into a trap. One by one, they fell to techniques learned in waters far more dangerous than San Francisco Bay. When the last hijacker fell, Bob stood on his bridge looking out at 200 passengers who were safe, a vessel that was secure, and harbor waters that had once again become peaceful. Coast Guard cutters were approaching from 3 directions, alerted by the coded distress signals Bob had been sending throughout the engagement. The questions came immediately. Who was he? How had he known what to do? Where had he learned to fight like that? Bob answered them with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to 16 years of ferry operations. Yes, he'd served in the Navy. Yes, he'd been trained for situations like this. No, he didn't consider himself a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But the investigation revealed more than Bob had wanted known. Military records that had been classified for years suddenly became relevant to a federal terrorism case. His service as a Navy SEAL, his deployments to combat zones, his specialized training in maritime anti-terrorism operations. It all came out in the reports and witness statements. The photo in the ferry terminal's employee break room, the one showing 16 years of safety awards and perfect service records, suddenly took on new meaning. That quiet captain in the background of every company photo wasn't just Bob the ferry operator. He was Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, decorated combat veteran, a warrior who'd spent 16 years quietly protecting San Francisco Bay. When Bob returned to work a week later, everything had changed. Passengers who'd barely acknowledged him for years now stopped to shake his hand and thank him. Harbor Patrol officers who'd worked alongside him for over a decade looked at him with new respect and understanding. The Coast Guard sent a delegation to meet the man who'd single-handedly prevented what could have been the worst maritime terrorist attack in American history. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" asked Lisa Chen as she boarded the ferry for her first trip back to work since the incident. Bob was quiet for a moment, looking out at the bay that had been his home for 16 years. "Some things are better left in the past," he said finally. "I came here to ferry people safely across the water, not to fight wars." But you saved all our lives. I protected my vessel, Bob replied simply. Same thing I've been doing for 16 years, just more obvious this time. The Harbor Queen returned to regular service the next week with enhanced security measures and a small memorial plaque near the bridge where the incident had taken place. It didn't mention Bob by name, he'd specifically requested that it not, but simply read, "In honor of those who navigate dangerous waters to keep others safe." Captain Sullivan continued running the morning ferry route, departing at precisely scheduled times and maintaining the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. But now people knew who he really was and what he'd been willing to do to keep them safe. The American flag that flew from the harbor, Queen's stern, didn't carry his name either, but everyone who saw it knew exactly who it honored and why a simple ferry had become a symbol of the hidden heroes who guard our waterways. Sometimes guardians wear uniforms and patrol in warships. Sometimes they wear captain's caps and ferry families across peaceful harbors, watching over people who trust them to navigate safely through waters that can turn dangerous without warning. Bob Sullivan had been both kinds of guardian, and in the end, that's all he'd ever wanted to be, someone who stood watch over others while they crossed from one safe shore to another. The bay was his responsibility. The passengers were his cargo, and for 16 years, he'd never failed to bring them home. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet competence made you feel safe without you knowing the danger they were watching for? Someone who guided you through troubled waters while keeping their own storms hidden? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching True Human Tales. If this story moved you, subscribe to support the channel. We publish stories that matter, stories that remind us that heroes don't always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most dangerous waters are navigated by the most peaceful captains. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, you never know who's guiding you safely home.